Welcome, everyone, to the 30-minute Midas touch from beautiful Dyersburg, Tennessee at the Herb Welsh WrestlePlex. Now, here is pound for pound and inch for inch, the best of the best in professional wrestling today. A wrestling genius worth his weight in gold. The Golden Boy, Greg Anthony.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 30-minute Midas touch. I am your host, the Golden Boy, Greg Anthony, and with me as always is my co-host, the Mecca of manhood.
Oh no,
Mark
Tipton.
No!
Now your credibility is going to be called into question on that one. Oh my goodness, I certainly don't know if I can live up to that one. I do appreciate the monikers each week as always. And you have thrown me yet another curveball. That one doesn't exactly match up with the subject of this week's 30-minute Midas Touch podcast, but I do appreciate the moniker.
It does a little bit.
Okay, well,
So the Mecca of manhood was Shawn Stasiak.
Oh!
Right? Shawn Stasiak's dad was Stan the
Man.
who actually beat Bruno Sammartino for the title for like a week or something. But
well, okay. And let's see, I have to watch out. Sometimes you go...
I go deep.
Yeah, you go
deep cut.
Yeah, some of those things fly right over my head. I didn't catch on to that one. I guess the way I want to introduce the subject formally is to say I have mentioned my esteem for the Nature Boy Ric Flair.
Yeah.
And when this subject crossed my mind, one of the things was a rhetorical question that he frequently asked during his interview segments was, "What's causing all this?" I heard it over and over again.
Yep.
And whether you're a devotee to sports entertainment or the traditional professional wrestling, you recognize that it is sports-based. Mm-hmm. And when you look around the world, whether it's, I believe Wimbledon's going on now, the Olympics are coming up, in all those things, what it is about becoming a champion. Mm-hmm. And so the subject of this week's podcast is championships.
Yeah, absolutely. And this was actually suggested by one of my friends, Kevin Jackson, who used to be a professional wrestler, and I think he's in the military, so he's not involved in professional wrestling anymore, but it's still obviously a huge fan and listens to the podcast and things like that. So he suggested, hey, it would be great to hear your guys' thought process on titles. And, that's definitely one of the subjects that, me being the Golden Boy Greg Anthony, my name comes from the fact that I was going to be a champion. That's
what you wanted and pursued, and it's what drew you.
Right, exactly. So that was kind of the whole basis of the Golden Boy Greg Anthony. So I think that's a pretty good place to do a podcast on championship titles.
Absolutely, because what is the ultimate goal? To become the champion. I suppose one thing I guess the way to really go about it is let's go through some of the championships, your viewpoints on them. They're maybe, with your knowledge of history, you could give a little background on them and talk about those sorts of things. Is there any championship in particular you would like to start with?
I think we should start with, the current titles just because they're current.
Well, sure.
I'm obviously not a big fan of the way the WWE, they've got into this thing where they're just trying to brand everything the same and just change colors. You understand?
Yes.
So I'm not a big fan of the Universal title and the WWE title looking exactly the same except for the strap. I just feel like, and that's the way I feel about a lot of stuff in WWE is I feel it's lazy. You know what I mean? Same thing with their pay-per-views. The pay-per-views are Hell in a Cell and TLC. It's like they're naming them after gimmick matches so they can have the gimmick matches on those shows, but they're not progressing the storylines to the point where those matches need to take place, and that's when they're no longer gimmick matches, right? You're just doing them to fucking do them, So that's kind of how I feel about the championships. I feel like it's the illusion of creativity. You know what I mean? Like all these guys that they've got there that claim to be television writers, comedy writers, all these, really supposedly ingenious people, and the best they can come up with is the WWE logo with two different colored straps. I mean,
yeah, and well, this is going to get into a little criticism. I was going to try to stay a little more positive at the beginning of this, but we'll go into this. I personally dislike the form that both of those championships have taken, and it's because, well, for instance, I believe Stephanie McMahon's a official title is something along the lines of chief brand officer or vice president of branding or something like that, because branding has become such a thing.
Yeah.
And you see, when professional sports teams win championships, Triple H will publicly announce that I'm sending this team a championship belt. And for instance, during celebration parades, I'll see athletes wearing, carrying that.
Yeah.
And they want, and the point of that is marketing.
Yeah.
But to me, when I see that, it diminishes the in professional wrestling world aspect of it. When I think about it, and I guess I'll just call out a couple. When I think of the viewpoint on the championship itself, should be the image I have is Shawn Michaels on his knees holding it as Vince McMahon proclaims the boyhood dream has come true.
Right.
Or one that strikes home to me is when I would watch the Nature Boy Ric Flair hold the 10 pounds of gold in front of him on the Superstation on Saturday afternoons and say that this is the most prestigious prize in all the professional sports.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way that I want it looked at, other than just a tool for marketing.
Yeah, and that's a very, very good point. And the thing too with the, like you say, the branding and things like that is that it loses being special, right? Like if everyone can get one, I remember a time when you couldn't get a title belt. You know what I mean? You'd have to pay $5,000 to get something like that, and now you can buy them on Amazon for $125.
Certainly.
You know what I mean? So like it's lost a little bit of its luster. But another thing too is because, and you kind of made this point, but I'll hit it home for you, is when you watch other sports, there's the
Yes, the Olympics going on, Wimbledon's going on.
but all those championships have stayed the same a long, long time.
The Stanley Cup.
The Stanley Cup. I mean, all those things have stayed the same design because that mental image is one they want, because that's progressing the story from 1970 to 95 to, you see what I'm saying, to where we are now. Like, it can be tracked all the way back. So, like, WWF, for instance, a lot of people have said, and I've said this before too, I think that the Winged Gold belt, the Winged Eagle belt, is the number one title. So, for WWF. So I think that should be the main one. Maybe a little bit bigger version, obviously, but I mean that should be the title because it has that history behind it.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and it's a little bit ironic. This is the company that often says then, now, and forever. But and I would also say I thought it's nice that if the belts weren't identical, because it kind of differentiates the title, because you had to think you might have to think about now which one's the Universal and which one's the WWE Championship. They're essentially the same thing.
Yeah.
It's not something I appreciate. I suppose, since we brought up history and lineage, would you like to talk about? I already mentioned the 10 pounds of gold.
Yeah, I mean the 10 pounds of gold. So there was several world titles before 1948, right? In different areas. Obviously, there was a world title in Chicago. There was a world title in New York. There was a world title in several different places. Eventually, the NWA was formed in 1948, and they unified all those titles basically, and crowned one champion, and that was Orville Brown. So, from that, 1948, that's a long, long time ago, right? So, and that history has carried on, and the NWA World Title is actually the catalyst for every major title, up until AEW, is the most major world titles. Like even WWF title. The WWF title was created because Lou Thez had beaten Buddy Rogers, right? Mm-hmm. But it wasn't at 2 out of 3 falls. So when the WWF withdrew from the NWA, they said, well, he beat Rogers for the title, but it wasn't 2 out of 3 falls. So we're going to crown him the WWF World Champion.
Okay.
All right. So that was one of them. Obviously, WCW, was a lineage from the Crockett's and the 10 pounds of gold anyway. Then they started calling it the World International title or something. The WCW International World Title. It was some weird thing that it was for a while, which was ridiculous.
No, it is what it is.
Yeah, right. But then TNA, obviously TNA, that they utilized
Used it.
NWA
Yes, certainly.
as first and foremost. So yeah, every major company, even ECW, they use it in a negative light by throwing it down and proclaiming that they're not gonna quote unquote have a torch passed to them, but they're gonna ignite a new flame, the flame of extreme, or whatever he said. I think I'm pretty close on that. But so like the NWA World Title, and I've said this before, the 10 pounds of gold and the NWA are to me the most important letters in professional wrestling history, and it sucks that Billy Corgan is in charge of those letters now. So I really feel like now more than ever we need to protect the history of our business.
All right. Well, I thank you for bringing up the ECW incident, because that's one that did stick out in my mind. Because at least for me, I don't know if it officially did, but I consider it the point where Eastern Championship Wrestling became Extreme Championship Wrestling.
Yeah, that was exactly what it was.
And Shane Douglas, throwing down the NWA Championship and grabbing the ECW Championship, it certainly made waves throughout the wrestling world, and it really put ECW on the map and really gave them a jump start.
Yeah, that, and it did completely change the business. You know what I mean? Because like that, the ECW influence, even though they don't want to admit it, influenced both WCW and WWE very heavily.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Obviously, they tried to do a corporate version of it. They weren't going to go full tilt like ECW did. But I believe that Shane Douglas throwing down the NWA World Title and Hogan turning heel are the two most important events of the 90s.
All right.
You know what I mean? Because I think those two things really legitimately changed the business, like in one moment.
Well, I do think that's fair. And as you mentioned that, I thought, well, in WCW and WWF, we saw the introduction of hardcore championships. And for better or worse, depending on your point of view.
Well, yeah, even just the realistic aspect of it. Because, WWE was very cartoony.
Yes.
Before ECW. WCW was, kind of WWE light at that point. But they really wanted to start having more realism and more edge. And I really feel like that came more from Paul Heyman's influence than it did anyone else's. I've heard before that Vince McMahon, as smart as he is, he's actually not that big of a creative genius. Like, he's a great character and he can get himself over, but like as far as coming up with idea after idea after idea, he's not, that. Same thing with Eric Bischoff. Like, I read Eric Bischoff's book, and the thing that he had going for him was that he was not a wrestling guy. So he was thinking outside the box, which was great, but the problem was he didn't have a wrestling guy
to pull him back,
and say, hey, this only works here because of this. We need to do this, this, and this. This is how you get to where you're going.
All right. And in fairness, I may be wrong this, but I believe that the notion of the NWO was taken from something that occurred in Japan, I believe.
Yeah.
So, and that's the world of professional wrestling. So those types of things don't concern me too much. One of the things that I wanted to see what you thought about was, and we kind of got into it, how the Universal and WWE championships are just different colored leather straps. One of the things that I've considered somewhat controversial was the trend of customizing the championship. I would say I may even start it. We talked about the Ultimate Warrior some time ago, and he became famous for changing the color of the strap with his, and there may have been someone who did this earlier, but he was what I consider kind of the beginning of the customization of the championship to the person who holds it. Do you approve of that?
It's like I thought it was cool when it was happening. Like it was cool to see a teal Winged Eagle title on the Ultimate Warrior. You know what I mean? It was cool to see Stone Cold Smoking Skull Belt. You know what I mean? But now that I'm a promoter now and a booker, and I've been in the business for so many years, I really feel like we said before that it needs to be a consistent or a constant in whatever promotion you are, that, hey, this Stanley Cup or this prize or whatever it is. So I really feel like it needs a visual representation that carries from person to person, so you can go, that guy is, they're all related. They're all connected.
Right. I do appreciate that because the things I thought about was I believe you mentioned the Smoking Skulls. There was the Brahma Bull belt, and really controversial for some of you out there, I'm sure, was the infamous Spinner belt.
Yeah, the U.S. title and
Yes, the WWE Championship also became.
yeah,
Uh, I suppose the thing that bothered me about that, and let's see if you agree about this, is it almost made the championship secondary to the person carrying it, and I did not necessarily care for that.
yeah. It just made it, like you said, it made it look like a toy. You know what I mean? Like it was some kind of, the title's not prestigious enough. It just needs to be like a plaything. No, it needs to be prestigious. It needs to be what everyone's fighting for. You know what I mean? Like, would really everyone fight for that? Oh, I can't wait to hold the spinner belt. No, not really.
All right. Well, let's kind of turn it back on a more positive spin here. Let's ask just a general question here. What do you consider to be your favorite championship?
So my favorite championship design is the NWA World Television title, the red strap one. That is my favorite title of all time. And actually, it's very close to the NWA National title, the classic NWA National title. That I'm a 3-time former NWA National Heavyweight Champion. So but that's not the reason. I love that title since I was a kid, and I don't know if it was. Actually, one of the first shows that I ever went to was at the Mid-South Coliseum, and it was an NWA show, and it was Sting versus Muta for the television title.
Oh, goodness.
You know what I mean? So I actually had a picture of the legit title, because I was third row, so I was able to, go over Lance Russell's shoulder and get a picture. So like that always, just stuck out with me. And of course, being a huge fan of Arn Anderson, and honestly Bobby Eaton and guys like that ended up holding stunning Steve Austin. I just always liked that title, and it was always a good workhorse kind of title. And that's kind of what I think a lot of companies always need is that. Yeah, you're going to have your one title, your main title, that's the draw and stuff like that. But then you need to have one title that's a pure wrestling kind of thing, and like Intercontinental title, television title, obviously.
Yeah, I do want to mention you're really checking items off my list here. I had that championship in particular I wanted to bring up. Obviously, when I think about it on the Superstation on Saturday afternoon. And the first picture that comes to my mind is actually Tully Blanchard carried it for a time period. I want to say he feuded with Dusty Rhodes in particular. They had a long-term feud that was centered around that championship. And maybe for this, maybe because it was red and it was primarily red and silver, as opposed to the others at the time were involved gold in some fashion.
Sure.
And I thought that kind of made it stand out.
Yeah.
If that's fair. Let me get into something. The championships. And see what you think about this. What I refer to as invented championships, and see how you feel about those. Now, the ones I'm going to refer to as invented, I'll tell more when I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about, for instance, the $1 Million Championship is probably the most prestigious of them. We also saw the Internet Champion make its way, and I would just to throw in what I've seen on television recently was the FTW Champion.
Right.
All these things, they weren't as a representative of a company or an organization, however it may be, but it was kind of something that was added on. Do you feel those are appropriate, or do they diminish championships in general?
I think that they're good in the short term. You understand? But I wouldn't want to see it, over a 10-year period every week. You understand? So like the $1 Million title was, and we've talked about this before on the show, was, one of the best stories in wrestling history.
Right.
How it all came about was, Steamboat won the Intercontinental title from Randy Savage at WrestleMania 3, but then a couple months later decided, hey, I need to go home and spend time with my kids. So he put in his notice. His last night he was supposed to wrestle Butch Reed. They were going to put the title on Butch Reed. Then Randy Savage was going to chase Butch Reed, right? Well, Butch Reed no shows. So then they're kind of scrambling, like, what do we do? What do we do? And then Honky Tonk Man comes around the corner and like, well, what about Honky? He's got heat. He's a heel. We can just put it on him. So Honky Tonk Man beat Ricky Steamboat for the Intercontinental title. And then they tell him the plan of, well, putting it on Savage. And like, he's like, well, no, I'm not putting him over now because you guys could fire me tomorrow and then you beat me on national television. So he politicked to where he wasn't going to drop the title to him. So then they're like, well, we've already promised Savage this big babyface run as Intercontinental Champion. What are we going to do? I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll make him the World Heavyweight Champion, right? Problem is, they'd already promised Ted DiBiase that he was going to be the World Champion. So then they went to DiBiase and said, well, you know what? You being the $1 Million Man, you wouldn't necessarily, if it would be more heat if you created your own title.
Right.
Like you fell short of winning the world title, but then you created your own title.
Well, yeah, you couldn't win it the right way,
The old-fashioned way.
Yeah, you couldn't earn it, so you just bought it, and it really, in honesty, it may have led to the enduring nature of that character, the $1 Million Man. He still makes appearances. He was just on NXT,
Mm-hmm.
and
They just had a ladder match
for that championship. So it really lasted and held on. It's probably the foremost example of what I was describing, but I'll turn, let's say, the Internet Championship.
Yeah, like I said, once again in the short term, like Zack Ryder, wasn't getting any TV time, decided to go out on his own YouTube show and just kind of test the waters and see if he could, do some fun things, and did some fun things and got over, and then, like I said, created the Internet Champion because he was the most influential wrestler on social media at that point, because everyone else was just kind of fucking figuring it out, but he really hit the ground running with it. And he was what everyone was, YouTube, Twitter, things like that. He was on it, So, like I said, I think it'd been good for the short term. You know what I mean? But I personally think Zack Ryder is one of the biggest missed opportunities in professional wrestling over the last 10, 20 years. Because, like I said before, he was so over that they were chanting his name when he wasn't even out there. And that's a very special quality in professional wrestling. And they just completely turned a deaf ear to it and said, no, kid, you're not getting over now. And, shut the door on his career pretty much.
Yeah, it felt like more in exercising their authority as management more than listening to the audience.
Yeah.
Which, in my opinion, as a member of that audience, it's a mistake. And we've seen the recent return of the FTW Championship in AEW. With the Team Taz, I believe it is. They brought it out and kind of brought that back in. But I appreciated it because it was like the others, a storyline championship. It was designed to kind of...
Yeah, same thing. Like Taz thought he was the unclaimed World Heavyweight Champion back in the ECW days before he actually beat Shane Douglas and became the champion. So he proclaimed himself the FTW World Heavyweight Champion. So, I mean, it made sense. Like, but like I said, that was a short-term thing, too, because eventually he did win the title, and then he was just the ECW World Champion.
All right. Well, one of the championships that I did want to make sure we got mentioned during the course of this, that to me was a long-term storyline and real life, so to speak, part of the business, and that was what came to be known as the Flair belt. Because obviously we saw it, this, and you can probably give the history better than I, but it involved Ric Flair leaving WCW and making his way to WWF and bringing the physical championship belt with him.
The big gold.
Yes. Which they later referred to as the World Championship, but to me it was always the Flair belt.
Right. And that was ingenious too. Again, apparently the story goes that, when you were champion back in the day, you had to put down a deposit of, I think it was like $25,000 or $50,000, and then when your time, they basically put that money in an account somewhere, and it drew interest, and then when you weren't champion anymore, you got your deposit back. It's kind of the way it's supposed to happen. So when Flair was champion and he was leaving, he told Jim Hurt, hey, I want my deposit back, my money, and Jim Hurt said, no, you're not getting it. So that's when he jumped, he took the title with him and showed up on WWF television with it. So, I don't blame Flair for that one. I think that was obviously a mistake by Jim Herd and just the management in general. But like you said, that title is synonymous with Ric Flair because, obviously when that came out in the late 80s, the big gold belt, he was the guy, you know what I mean? And he always ended up back with it somehow because he was the most proven. The most proven champion they had, so they kept going back to him because it worked. So yeah, obviously we talk about him being a 16-time world champion, but in actuality he's like a 25, 26-time world champion.
Certainly.
Because there's weird lineages and title changes that weren't recognized and just random stuff like that. But I mean, he actually holds a lot more world titles than is proclaimed.
Well, yeah, and just to kind of top off on that, I remember that the WCW used the image of that championship in the opening of one of its shows. I want to say Main Event, but they had one of their weekly shows. It might have been Clash of the Champions.
Yeah, I think it was Clash.
Where you would see the championship belts, kind
Spinning.
of spin across the screen, and that championship was one of those that was featured.
Yeah.
Because of the prestige it held, and so having that leave your organization to me seemed tone deaf. And for all we want to criticize Vince McMahon, I will say when that belt became digitized and Ric Flair proclaimed himself the real world champion and Hulk Hogan was merely a company champion and the WWF would allegedly digitize the belt, those are images that stick in my mind and I remember fondly.
Yeah, absolutely, because that was a smart thing. WCW obviously sued and had an injunction or whatever it was for them showing the title on television until they could figure out what was going on. So, and then actually, I don't know if you knew this or not, but actually, Flair ended up having to return the belt. So some of those digitized things aren't the actual world title.
Oh,
it's actually another title, but
okay.
You wouldn't know
I
that.
wouldn't know the difference
because they were digitizing it. So it's just him walking out with a title.
Well, credit to them for doing all that because it did, and I thought it really added to the storyline of Flair versus Hogan and the rivalry between the two. I guess one thing I want to say quickly, and we may not spend too much time on this, but one of the championships we mentioned, we're talking about current championships at the beginning. There is a current championship that I am not fond of at all. And I want to see what your perception of this one is. And it is the 24/7 7-Eleven European I-95 South My Baby Championship. I forgot the list in total, but it's something like that.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of that title at all. Obviously, but it does kind of call back. I don't know if they meant to do this or not, but it does kind of call back to one of those original WWF titles, the green one with the nameplates on the side and the circle thing. So I think it's kind of a callback to it. But yeah, it's just so bad. It's like it's so bland and so like why? Like we talked about before, if you're a champion, it should be something everyone wants, right? Like who wants to carry around the puke green belt?
Absolutely. I guess let me stay with this very quickly. I'll try to get in this. There's kind of 2 points that I want to try to meld into one here quickly.
Let me make a point on that before we get going on that too.
All right.
Back to the 24/7 thing was that's indicative of television writers being told, "Hey, we need to bump our numbers up. What can we do?" They go back and look when the numbers were high, and they go, "Oh, they had a hardcore
which was
24/7."
Yes.
So they tried to reinvent that to help whatever, and of course it didn't work. It didn't help or anything because it's past its expiration date.
All right. One of the things I want to try to discuss and see what your perception is. One of the things that I've over the years objected to is what I refer to as mistreatment of the championship, the physical belt itself. This can take the form of the mental image I want the audience to understand is, for instance, one of my favorites, Mick Foley, I've mentioned in this podcast before, would come to the ring and toss it into the air and have it fall into the ring. Stone Cold Steve Austin did similar things where they would toss it around. And a side part of this, kind of meld these 2 points into one, is the championship in recent years became popularly used as a foreign object to whack your opponent over the head with. Both of these are things that I'm not a particular fan of, and I want to see how you feel about those two the treatment of the championship itself.
I'm okay with using it as a weapon sometimes. Obviously, not every match or anything like that, but every once in a while, I think it does add to it because it is a legitimately, if you got hit legitimately with a championship, it would fucking hurt. You'd probably get knocked out. So, yeah, but I don't like you said, Stone Cold throwing it into the ring. I don't even like guys carrying it. I want them to wear it around their waist like they're supposed to. So even things like that. But also, like you said, it does diminish the title because if a guy's just going to throw it around or whatever, then, what is it really worth? Because you wouldn't do anything of worth like that, right? And just to give you kind of an indication of my thought process on it too was, as I've talked about before, I was heel in this business for 15 years, a long 15 years. The way that I turned babyface was I had the title on my shoulder and another heel was talking trash to me and knocked my title off the shoulder. And it landed on the mat.
Oh, no.
And then I kind of got that look like, you son of a bitch. And that's when I turned him around, and that was the big babyface turn of the Golden Boy, Greg Anthony. You know what I mean? So, once again, telling the story of why I'm the Golden Boy because of the championship. So, you disrespected not just a championship, but my championship. Ergo, you're going to feel the wrath of Greg Anthony. So, it's all story time things, right? So, if, like you said, if we're telling a story from the minute we walk out of the curtain to the minute we walk back. So if you come in, you throw the title in the ring, then you're basically telling the story that that title isn't worth anything because you're just tossing it around like that.
All right. Well, thank you. That little story, that kind of drove home on a personal level for you what has stuck out to me. I just keep in mind, my image is being told this is the most prestigious prize. That phrase is stuck in my memory. And as a young person watching, a young Mark Tipton, I believed every word of what was being said. And when you have something that you prize, something that you value, you put it on your mantelpiece. You put it in people have trophy cases built to hold these types of things. And so that's why I view that in the way that I do. One of the things that I think we have to deal with as time's drawing short here is evolve around an individual named Vincent Russo.
I wish I knew his middle name right now, so I could middle name his ass. Like
well,
Vincent Andrew Russo or
the way you refer to a suspected criminal,
Yeah,
I suppose. Right. Okay. His viewpoint on championships is very different from mine. And in particular, he had an angle that involved the actor David Arquette. So I'd like to let you kind of speak on that, if you would.
Well, tell the quote. What's Vince Russo's quote?
The thing I remember him most associated with describing championships as, quote, "It's just a prop."
Yeah, and I've heard that since then, repeated by other guys, and that's why we talk about why we do the show. This is one of the reasons, because the void gets filled either way. Right now, there's out there someone saying, "Hey, it's just a prop," and to an extent, that is correct. But the whole thing is, we're not trying to have it be a prop. We're trying to have it be, like you said, the most important prize in whatever company or sport we're competing in, right? Even if professional wrestling was just a television show and it was a television show about wrestling, you understand the still basis of it would still be a competition between two guys and there would still be a title involved. You understand?
Absolutely.
So, I think that's one point that obviously Vince Russo misses many, many points when it comes to professional wrestling. But, it's not just a prop. It's the single most, I think, useful storytelling tool that you have. And I think it needs to be treated as such. But, David Arquette. You want me to talk about David Arquette?
Yeah, we do want to deal with that.
Okay, so obviously not a fan of David Arquette being a former WCW World Heavyweight Champion. That's a horrible idea. Vince Russo still to this day, proclaims that was a great idea because we're still talking about it. So ergo, it must be a good idea. Well, we still talk about Hitler too. You know what I mean? That doesn't really compute. You understand? Bad ideas are bad ideas, and that did not draw them any more money than it did before.
No.
Now, what I will say about David Arquette is that I am impressed with him coming back to professional wrestling and trying to garner some kind of respect because he realized this was kind of an unfinished thing for him, but he's so tied to it now because of the history of it that he wouldn't come back and do something positive. So, and I haven't got to see the documentary yet, But apparently, it's really good. And I have friends that have worked with Dave Arquette, and they're really impressed with him trying to get better.
All right. And I suppose if I want to speak in his defense, it may be possible that he didn't understand the ramifications
No,
of,
not at all.
of what
Who
was going
would?
on there. He made the Ready to Rumble movie, I believe was the
Yeah.
title of it, and so he was just around that, and it was really just a notion to promote that movie, I believe, more than anything.
Yeah, and like Bobby Eaton always says too, like when I'd mention guys, oh, this guy shouldn't have got pushed, or this guy shouldn't have got that, or this, he says, what are they supposed to do? Tell them no. Like what are they supposed to do? Like tell them I don't want to be world champion.
Right.
So I mean, yeah, I completely understand that.
All right. I do believe we've run over time once again.
We have run over time, but we're a lot tighter than we were last week with with the women. we're just a tad over 35 minutes this time. Like I said, we will never be exactly 30 minutes, but we always be roundabout. Ladies and gentlemen, I am your host, the Golden Boy Greg Anthony, and with me, as always, my co-host, the Mecca of manhood, Mark Tipton. Thank you and goodbye.